You can lose 20 pounds and still have a belly. And that is not a motivation problem or a willpower problem. It is a targeting problem because the fat packed around your internal organs does not respond the same way surface fat does. It sits deeper. It wraps around your liver and your pancreas and your heart. And this is the fat that is quietly driving the chronic conditions that are shortening lives every single day. We are talking about type 2 diabetes, fatty liver, heart disease, and even certain cancers. The bad news is most people trying to lose belly fat are doing things that burn subcutaneous fat, the soft fat just under the skin, while barely touching the stuff that is actually dangerous. The good news is visceral fat is actually the first fat your body wants to burn once you know how to target it specifically. And that is exactly what we are going to cover today. The right foods, the right drinks, the right type of exercise, and the one daily habit most people over 50 are completely ignoring. If you stay to the end, you will have a clear and practical plan you can start this week. Part 1. What is visceral fat and why is it different? Before we talk about how to get rid of it, you need to understand why visceral fat behaves so differently from the fat on your hips or your thighs or your arms. When you pinch fat on your stomach, that soft layer right under the skin is called subcutaneous fat. That is the visible kind. But visceral fat lives deeper, inside the abdominal cavity, packed tightly around your organs. You cannot see it or pinch it, but you can measure it indirectly. If you are a man with a waist circumference over 40 inches, or a woman over 35 inches, there is a strong chance you are carrying a significant amount of visceral fat. And here is why it matters so much more than regular body fat. Visceral fat is metabolically active. It does not just sit there. It constantly releases inflammatory chemicals called cytokines directly into your bloodstream. It also releases free fatty acids straight into the portal vein, which feeds directly into your liver. This is one of the main reasons visceral fat is so strongly linked to insulin resistance and fatty liver disease. It is not just excess weight. It is an active source of inflammation in the center of your body. The other reason visceral fat gets so much attention in the research is that it responds very quickly to the right interventions. Unlike subcutaneous fat, which can be stubborn and slow to shift, visceral fat is highly sensitive to changes in diet and exercise. That is actually great news. It means that when you make the right changes, you can start seeing meaningful reductions in visceral fat within just a few weeks, even before the number on the scale moves much. And that is an important point we are going to come back to. The scale is a poor indicator of what is happening to visceral fat specifically. Some of the most dramatic improvements in visceral fat you will see in the research involve no significant change in total body weight at all. The body is recomposing. Fat is coming off where it matters most, even if the overall number stays roughly the same. Part 2. The foods that target visceral fat. Let us start with food because what you eat every single day is either feeding your visceral fat or it is starving it. There is no neutral. And one of the most powerful categories of food for specifically reducing visceral fat are carotenoid-rich vegetables. Carotenoids are the natural pigments that give plants their color. They are what makes carrots orange, tomatoes red, and spinach that deep dark green. But they are not just decorative. Carotenoids are powerful antioxidants. And that matters here because so much of what drives visceral fat accumulation is a cycle of energy excess leading to oxidative stress, which leads to inflammation, which disrupts metabolism and makes fat storage worse. Carotenoids interrupt that cycle. They neutralize free radicals, which are the unstable molecules that damage cells and drive that inflammatory loop. And beyond that, carotenoids can actually influence gene expression. Specifically, they have been shown to turn on genes that promote fat burning and quiet down genes that tell your body to store fat. There was a randomized double-blind trial conducted in Japan that looked at whether carotenoid intake directly affects visceral fat. What they found was significant. Just 8 weeks of eating carotenoid-rich vegetables produced measurable reductions in visceral fat. And the most important finding was that all 4 groups in the study, every single group that ate carotenoid-rich vegetables, lowered their visceral fat. It was not one specific carotenoid doing all the work. The whole category delivered results. So how do you get enough carotenoids in your daily diet? The rule is simple. Target colorful vegetables and fruits. Carrots, sweet potatoes, red and orange bell peppers, spinach, kale, squash, tomatoes. Any plant food with a rich, deep color is going to be loaded with some form of carotenoid. This is not about eating any single superfood. It is about consistently putting color on your plate every day. Now, after carotenoids, the next compound you need to know about is catechins. Catechins are a type of flavonoid polyphenol that also function as antioxidants and anti-inflammatory agents. And the best and easiest way to get catechins into your daily routine is through green tea. You have probably heard that green tea burns fat, and that reputation is actually earned. Green tea is rich in catechins, and these compounds change the way your body handles fat at a very fundamental level. First, catechins boost fat oxidation and energy expenditure. They stimulate the nervous system to burn up more fat and increase your baseline metabolic rate. Second, catechins inhibit an enzyme called lipase, which is responsible for processing dietary fat during digestion. So they are actually blocking some of the fat you eat from being absorbed in the first place. And green tea also contains caffeine, which works together with catechins in a synergistic way to enhance fat utilization. There was a double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized trial in Japan that showed that just 12 weeks of drinking catechin-enriched green tea at around 600 milligrams of catechins per day resulted in a significant reduction in visceral fat specifically, not just overall body weight. Visceral fat. Now, most green teas contain catechins, but if you want to maximize the benefit, the teas to look for are minimally processed varieties like matcha or sencha. These retain the highest concentration of active compounds because they have not been heavily processed. 2 to 3 cups per day is a reasonable target. The other food category that consistently shows up in the research on visceral fat reduction is fiber, specifically soluble fiber. Soluble fiber forms a gel-like substance in your gut that slows digestion, blunts blood sugar spikes, and feeds beneficial gut bacteria. And there is a direct link between gut bacteria health and visceral fat accumulation. When the gut microbiome is disrupted, inflammation increases, and visceral fat tends to follow. Soluble fiber is one of the most reliable ways to support a healthy microbiome, and by extension, keep visceral fat in check. Good sources of soluble fiber include oats, barley, beans, lentils, peas, flaxseed, and most fruits and vegetables. The goal for most adults is somewhere around 25 to 35 grams of total fiber per day, and most people eating a typical Western diet get nowhere near that. On the flip side, the biggest dietary driver of visceral fat is excess sugar, and specifically fructose. When you consume large amounts of fructose, it bypasses normal metabolic pathways and gets processed almost exclusively in the liver. When the liver is overwhelmed with fructose, it converts the excess directly into fat and stores it viscerally. This is the mechanism behind non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and it is one of the primary reasons that sugar-sweetened beverages are so strongly linked to visceral fat accumulation. Soda, juice, sports drinks, sweetened coffees. These deliver concentrated fructose directly into the liver with no fiber to slow absorption. Cutting these out or dramatically reducing them is one of the single highest leverage dietary changes you can make for visceral fat specifically. Refined carbohydrates in general, things like white bread, white rice, most breakfast cereals, pastries, chips, and packaged snack foods, drive the same cycle. They spike blood sugar rapidly, trigger a large insulin response, and excess calories get routed into fat storage. When insulin is chronically elevated, fat burning is suppressed. The body cannot access its fat stores efficiently. So even if you are eating at a rough caloric maintenance, consistently high insulin levels keep that visceral fat locked in place. Part 3. The exercise that actually works. Now, here is where it gets interesting. Because there is a large body of research showing that exercise has an even stronger targeted effect on visceral fat than diet does. We have a meta-analysis of 117 studies showing that while diet has a larger effect on total body weight loss, exercise tends to have a superior and more targeted effect on reducing visceral fat specifically. The two work best together, but if you had to choose one lever that directly attacks visceral fat, exercise wins. And there was an older but very compelling study that showed just how powerful even a small dose of the right exercise can be. In this study, participants did just two 45-minute cycling sessions per week for 2 months. That is 2 sessions a week. Not 5, not 7. 2. And the results were remarkable. Visceral fat was reduced by 48%, almost half, in just 2 months. On top of that, insulin sensitivity improved by 41%, and subcutaneous fat dropped by 18%. These were not elite athletes pushing themselves to exhaustion. The exercise intensity was moderate, around 70 to 80% of maximum heart rate. That is the level where you can still hold a conversation but you sound a little winded. And here's the part of that study that is especially relevant for people who are discouraged by the scale. Total body weight barely changed. The scale showed almost nothing, but the visceral fat was almost cut in half. This is the single most important thing to understand about measuring your progress when targeting visceral fat. The scale will often lie to you. Your waist measurement, your energy levels, your metabolic markers on blood work, these tell you the real story. So what is the best type of exercise for visceral fat reduction? A recent systematic review and meta-analysis that looked at 84 randomized controlled trials found that vigorous intensity aerobic exercise and high-intensity interval training are the most effective modalities for specifically reducing visceral fat. Resistance training is still very important, and we are going to talk about it. But when it comes to visceral fat specifically, cardio wins. Now, between high-intensity interval training and steady-state aerobic exercise, the honest answer from the research is that both work very well and the difference between them is small. Studies comparing the two directly show similar reductions in visceral fat with no statistically significant difference in adults. There may be a slight edge for high-intensity interval training in some populations, particularly younger people, but in adults over 50 the gap is minimal. So do not get paralyzed trying to pick the perfect protocol. Here is the way to think about it practically. The best exercise for visceral fat is the one you will actually do consistently. A textbook perfect high-intensity interval training workout that you dread and only get yourself to do twice a month will always lose out to a brisk walk that you genuinely enjoy and do 4 times a week. Consistency beats intensity over a long enough timeline. That said, if you want a practical target based on the evidence, aim for 2 to 3 sessions per week of at least 45 minutes each at a moderate to vigorous intensity. Moderate means you can speak in full sentences, but you sound a little out of breath. Vigorous means you can only manage a few words at a time before needing to pause and breathe. Anything in that range, whether it is cycling, swimming, brisk walking on an incline, rowing, dancing, or jogging, will produce results. And the beautiful thing about exercise and visceral fat is that the relationship is dose-dependent. The research from the British Journal of Sports Medicine showed that participants who exercise more frequently or at higher intensities saw proportionally greater reductions in visceral fat. And critically, they did not see that same dose-dependent response with caloric restriction. There is a ceiling on how much benefit you get from cutting calories. With exercise, the more you do, the more visceral fat you lose. You do not need to starve yourself. You need to move. On the topic of resistance training, even though it is not the top tool for visceral fat reduction, it absolutely belongs in your routine. Resistance training builds and preserves muscle mass, and muscle is metabolically active tissue. More muscle means a higher resting metabolic rate, which means you burn more calories even at rest. Over the long term, maintaining muscle mass after 50 is one of the most important things you can do for your metabolic health and your ability to stay lean. So do your cardio for visceral fat and do your resistance training for everything else. Part 4, the habit most people over 50 ignore. There is one more factor that drives visceral fat accumulation that almost nobody talks about in the context of belly fat, and that is cortisol. Cortisol is your primary stress hormone, and when cortisol is chronically elevated, it does something very specific and very unfortunate. It selectively deposits fat in the abdominal region, not on your hips, not on your thighs, in your belly, viscerally. This is not a small effect. The research is clear and consistent. People with chronically elevated cortisol have significantly more visceral fat than people with normal cortisol levels, even when total body weight is similar. Cortisol also drives cravings for high-calorie, high-sugar comfort foods, which feeds the visceral fat accumulation even further. It suppresses fat burning and promotes fat storage by keeping insulin elevated. The entire loop works against you. And here is the thing. After 50, managing cortisol becomes more important than it was in your 30s. The body's stress response system becomes less efficient with age. Sleep disruption, chronic low-grade stress, overtraining without adequate recovery, all of these keep cortisol elevated in ways that compound over time. The highest leverage habits for keeping cortisol in check are sleep, stress management, and recovery. 7 to 9 hours of quality sleep is not optional for visceral fat reduction. A single night of poor sleep is enough to meaningfully raise cortisol levels and worsen insulin sensitivity the next day. If your sleep is broken, addressing it will do more for your visceral fat than almost any other change you can make. For stress management, breathing exercises and deliberate downtime are more powerful than most people realize. When you breathe slowly and deeply, you activate the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the calming counterpart to your fight or flight system. Even 5 to 10 minutes of slow, deliberate breathing per day has been shown to meaningfully reduce cortisol over time. It is not complicated. It is just underused. Putting it together. So here is the practical summary. On the food side, load your plate with colorful vegetables every day to get your carotenoids. Drink 2 to 3 cups of green tea daily for catechins. Prioritize soluble fiber from whole food sources. And cut out or dramatically reduce sugar-sweetened beverages. These are the highest leverage dietary moves for visceral fat specifically. On the exercise side, aim for 2 to 3 cardio sessions per week at moderate to vigorous intensity, at least 45 minutes each. Add resistance training 2 days per week to protect your muscle mass. And remember that the scale is not your primary measure of progress. Waist measurements and how your clothes fit are better indicators of what is happening viscerally. And on the lifestyle side, protect your sleep and manage your stress. These are not soft recommendations. They are metabolic interventions that directly affect cortisol and visceral fat. The research on this is encouraging. Meaningful reductions in visceral fat are possible within weeks when these changes are made consistently. And the improvements you will see in your energy levels, your blood sugar regulation, your blood pressure, and your overall metabolic health will be noticeable long before you see dramatic changes on the scale. Start with one area. Pick the change that feels most achievable for you right now. Build the habit, then layer the next one in. That is how this works long term.